The first shell hit at dawn, not with a warning, not with a siren or a whistle or the polite formality of an ultimatum. It came from the southern bank of the Yangtze River on a Tuesday morning in April, tearing through steel and timber as if neither had ever existed, and the men aboard the HMS Amethyst had approximately 3 seconds between the sound of the distant artillery and the moment the world around them became fire and smoke and screaming. The river, wide and gray and indifferent, swallowed the echoes and kept flowing. It had been flowing for 10,000 years before any of these men were born, and it would flow for 10,000 more after they were gone. But in that precise moment, on the morning of April the 20th, 1949, the men of the Amethyst were not thinking about history. They were thinking about survival. Somewhere deep in the belly of that ship, in the hot darkness below the main deck, a small black and white cat pressed himself flat against the metal floor as the concussion of the second shell rolled through the hull like a wave through water. He was not a large cat. He weighed perhaps 4 pounds at his heaviest, and he had no rank, no uniform, no training in naval warfare, no understanding of geopolitics or the Chinese Civil War or the ideological gulf between Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army and the retreating nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. What he had was something far simpler and far more powerful. He had already survived worse than this, and he had a job to do. His name was Simon. And before that morning was over, he would be burned, bloodied, and buried under collapsed timber. And still, he would crawl back. Not because anyone ordered him to, not because he understood duty in any abstract or philosophical sense, but because the ship was his home, and the men on it were his crew, and whatever was happening on the surface of the Yangtze River, the rats in the hold were not going to catch themselves. If you think that sounds like a small thing, if you think a cat chasing rats has no place in a story about war, then you have never spent 101 days trapped on a besieged vessel in a hostile foreign river with dwindling food, rising disease, and the knowledge that no one is coming to rescue you. In those circumstances, the small things are the only things keeping men alive. And Simon was not a small thing. He was a lifeline wearing fur. Let us go back. Let us go back past the battle and the burning and the blood, back to the place where this story actually begins, not on a warship, not on a great river in the middle of a revolution, but on a dock in Hong Kong, sometime in the early months of 1948, where a 14-year-old sailor named George Hickenbottom made a decision that would change a life. He found the cat in a dockyard, or perhaps the cat found him. These things are always ambiguous when cats are involved. The animal was small, malnourished, barely more than a kitten, his black and white coat matted with salt and grease, his ribs visible through the fur, his eyes carrying that particular expression that stray cats carry, not helplessness, never helplessness, but a kind of weary appraisal, a calculation being run behind amber eyes, a question being asked and answered in the same moment. Can I trust this human? And more importantly, is this human useful? George Hickenbottom passed the test. He smuggled the cat aboard the HMS Amethyst inside his cap, pressed against his skull, small enough and still enough to survive the indignity of being headwear. This is the kind of story that seems invented. It is not. The records are clear. The cat came aboard hidden in a hat, and the fact that this was the method of his arrival tells you everything about his character. From the very beginning, adaptable, patient, willing to endure temporary discomfort for a better situation, fundamentally practical in ways that most creatures, human or otherwise, never manage to be. He was given the name Simon. He was given no formal rank, no official role, no place on the ship's manifest. He was, in the language of the Royal Navy, a supernumerary, an extra, an addition, a creature whose presence was tolerated rather than sanctioned. At first, the Amethyst was a Black Swan-class sloop, or, as she had been recently reclassified, a frigate, though the sailors who served on her cared far less about naval taxonomy than they did about the fact that she was cramped, loud, perpetually damp, and home. She had been built during the Second World War, had seen action, had survived the chaos of that global catastrophe, and now, in 1948, was serving on the Far East Station, patrolling the waters around Hong Kong and Shanghai during one of the most volatile periods in Chinese history. The civil war between the communists and the nationalists, which had been grinding on with varying intensity since 1927, was in its terminal phase. Mao's forces were winning. The cities were falling one by one. The foreign powers, none the British, the Americans, the French, were navigating the situation with the particular combination of arrogance and anxiety that great powers always display when a country they have long considered within their sphere of influence begins to reorganize itself according to its own preferences. Simon, knowing nothing of any of this, made himself at home. He claimed the sleeping quarters, he investigated the engine room, he appeared on the bridge at inconvenient moments and regarded navigational charts with the focused concentration of a being who suspects the humans around him are not making the most rational decisions. He hunted. This is the part of his story that must be understood in its full context to be properly appreciated. The hunting was not recreational, and it was not trivial. The rats aboard the Amethyst, and indeed aboard most vessels operating in Asian waters in that era, were not the small, skittish creatures most people picture when they think of rats. These were river rats, dock rats, creatures that had evolved over generations in some of the world's busiest and most heavily trafficked port environments, fed on grain and garbage and everything in between, large and aggressive and completely unintimidated by either the presence of humans or the mechanics of a modern warship. They chewed through cables, they contaminated food stores, they carried leptospirosis and typhus, and a dozen other diseases that, on a ship at sea with limited medical supplies, could kill a man as efficiently as any cannon. The problem of rats aboard naval vessels is not a colorful historical footnote. It is a matter of operational survival. A serious rat infestation can render a ship non-functional. Simon understood this in the way that cats understand things. Completely, instinctively, and without the need for anyone to explain it to him. By the time the HMS Amethyst was ordered to sail up the Yangtze River in April of 1949, Simon had been aboard for over a year. He was no longer the starving stray from the Hong Kong dockyard. He was sleek and purposeful, with the confident proprietary air of a cat who knows exactly where he belongs. He had his routines. He had his preferred sleeping spots. He had his territory, which encompassed the entire ship, and which he patrolled with methodical thoroughness. He had his crew, and the crew, 220 men crammed into a steel hull on a river surrounded by armies, had him. The orders came in the way that orders always come in the Navy, matter-of-factly, officially, with the particular administrative neatness that military bureaucracies apply even to situations that are obviously profoundly dangerous. The Amethyst was to sail up the Yangtze from Shanghai to Nanking, the nationalist capital, to relieve the HMS Consort, which had been standing by to protect the British Embassy as the military situation around the city deteriorated. The distance was not great. The mission was routine, at least on paper. The Yangtze River had been used by British naval vessels for decades, and there were agreements, understandings, protocols, the comfortable architecture of international relations that everyone maintains until the moment it becomes inconvenient for one party to maintain it. It became inconvenient for the People's Liberation Army on the morning of April 20th, 1949. The Amethyst was approximately 60 miles from Shanghai, moving upriver in the gray, morning light, her white ensign flying, her international markings clear, when the PLA artillery batteries on the southern bank opened fire. The first shells struck at approximately 9:30. The official British position, then and afterward, was that the firing was entirely unprovoked. The PLA's position was that the Amethyst had entered a combat zone without permission and had ignored warning signals. The truth, as is usually the case with the truths of war, was somewhere in the space between these positions, complicated by miscommunication, by the fog of a revolution in its final chaotic days, by the arrogance of a British naval tradition that had not yet fully absorbed the lesson that the era of unquestioned British maritime authority in Chinese waters was over. None of this complexity mattered to the men on the deck of the Amethyst when the shells began hitting. In that moment, there was only the present tense, the immediate, the urgent question of who was still alive and where the next shell was going to land. The casualties were immediate and severe. The first salvo killed or wounded men on the bridge and deck. Lieutenant Commander Bernard Skinner, the ship's captain, was mortally wounded within the first minutes of the engagement. The first lieutenant took command and was almost immediately wounded himself. The chain of command was being shattered faster than it could reconstitute itself. Shells struck the wheelhouse. The radio room was hit. The medical bay was hit. Men who had been eating breakfast 20 minutes earlier were now lying on a deck that was running with blood, trying to remember their training, trying to function, trying simply to breathe through the smoke and the terror and the deafening percussion of artillery that did not stop. The Amethyst ran aground. In the chaos of the initial attack, with the bridge crew dead or wounded, and the ship taking fire from multiple directions, she drifted into the shallows on the north bank of the river and stopped. She was now stationary, which made her a perfect target, which was approximately the worst possible situation a ship can be in when being fired upon by shore-based artillery. The PLA batteries continued to fire. The consort attempted to come to her assistance and was itself heavily damaged. Two other British ships, the London and the Black Swan, made rescue attempts and were forced to withdraw. The Amethyst was on her own, buried under the wreckage of a forward compartment, covered in burns from the flash of a near-miss shell, with shrapnel wounds in his legs and body. His whiskers singed to almost nothing, was Simon. He was found hours after the initial attack by a sailor clearing debris, small and motionless, and burned so badly that the sailor who found him did not at first believe he was alive. He was taken to the ship's medical officer, who, dealing simultaneously with 25 human casualties, 17 of whom would not survive, found the time to treat a cat. Let that image sit with you for a moment. On a ship that had lost its captain, that had run aground under artillery fire, that had over 60 men dead or wounded, with ammunition running low and no clear way to escape. On that ship, in that moment, someone made the time to bandage a cat. That act tells you something about the crew of the Amethyst that no official document ever could. It tells you who these men were when everything else was stripped away. They expected Simon to die. The burns were bad. The shrapnel wounds were serious. He was dehydrated, in shock, and had lost his whiskers entirely, which, for a cat, is roughly equivalent to losing your primary navigation system. Without whiskers, cats cannot judge gaps, cannot move confidently through tight spaces, cannot hunt with the precision that hunting requires. The ship's medical officer treated him as best he could, wrapped him in cotton wool, put him in a box in a quiet corner, and left him to the decision that all wounded creatures must eventually make for themselves, whether to return or not. For 4 days, Simon lay in that box. He did not eat. He barely moved. The crew checked on him, and the checking on him became a ritual, a small daily ceremony that had nothing to do with naval procedure and everything to do with the particular human need, in times of extremity, to have something to care about beyond one's own survival. On the 5th day, Simon walked out of the box. His burns were still raw. His coat was patchy. His whiskers were gone. He was, by any objective measure, in no condition to be walking anywhere. He walked anyway. He walked through the ship, slowly and stiffly, but with the same proprietary air he had always carried. The air of a creature conducting an inspection of his own domain. He visited the wounded men in the makeshift ward the crew had set up in the forward mess. He jumped onto bunks. He sat beside men who were in pain and could not sleep and stayed with them in the way that cats stay. Not performing comfort, not dramatizing presence, simply being there, warm and alive and present in a way that required nothing and gave everything. And then he went hunting. This is the moment that, if you are not moved by it, you may want to check whether you have a pulse. The ship was still under intermittent fire. The food stores were running critically low. 25 men were dead. The captain was dead. The situation was, in every practical sense, desperate. And Simon, burned, wounded, whiskerless, barely recovered from injuries that should have killed him, went back to work. He found a rat in the forward hold, and he killed it. He found another and killed that too. He continued his patrols. He continued his visits to the wounded. He continued to appear on the bridge at inconvenient moments and regard the surviving officers with his expression of weary, amber-eyed appraisal. The effect on the crew was profound and immediate. You have to understand what it means psychologically to be trapped on a damaged ship in a hostile river for days that are becoming weeks. The routine is everything. The routine is the difference between a crew that functions and a crew that fractures. When the routine is disrupted, when captains die, when communications fail, when the normal architecture of naval life is blasted away by artillery, the crew needs something to anchor to. Simon, by simply continuing to do what he had always done, became that anchor. He was proof that normal life was still possible. He was proof that the world had not ended. He was 4 pounds of burned and bandaged cat who had decided, on his own terms and in his own time, that the ship still needed him. And he was right. The new commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander John Cairns, who came aboard a week after the initial attack to take command of the damaged and besieged vessel, understood this immediately. Cairns was a practical man, a Royal Navy officer of the old school, not given to sentiment, but acutely attuned to the morale of his crew. He saw what Simon was doing for the men. He saw the way they looked at the cat, the way they talked to him, the way his presence on the mess deck during the long, anxious nights of the siege changed the temperature of a room. He made Simon official. He gave him a formal promotion, an official designation, a place in the ship's records. Simon became Able Seaman Simon, and his duties were listed with the same matter-of-fact naval bureaucratic precision as anyone else's: rat catcher, morale officer, ship's company. If you find this charming, good. It is charming. But it is not merely charming. It is a decision made by a naval commander under combat conditions, a decision that cost nothing and bought everything. Because what Kirans understood, what every great leader understands, is that morale is not a soft thing. Morale is operational capacity. A crew that believes in itself, that has something beyond duty to fight for, that has a reason to keep functioning beyond the bare imperatives of survival, is a crew that will do things that no amount of training or discipline alone could produce. Simon was not a mascot in the trivial, decorative sense. Simon was infrastructure. The days on the Yangtze became weeks, and the weeks accumulated with the particular grinding slowness that all sieges share. The Amethyst was surrounded. The PLA had made it clear that the British vessel would not be permitted to leave without guarantees that the British government was unwilling to give. Specifically, a formal acknowledgement that the PLA was the legitimate military authority in the area. A statement that would have constituted a de facto recognition of the communist government at a moment when the Western powers were still officially maintaining their recognition of the nationalist government. The politics were, from the perspective of the men aboard, entirely irrelevant. They were trapped. Their food was running out. Their fuel was running out. Their ammunition was running out. Men were getting sick. The Yangtze summer was building toward its brutal, humid, fever-inducing peak. Simon hunted. The rats on the Yangtze were a particular variety of adversary, and this deserves more attention than it usually gets in accounts of the Amethyst Incident. The Yangtze River basin in the late 1940s was home to a population of Norway rats and roof rats that had thrived for generations in the grain stores and rubbish heaps and warehouses of one of the world's busiest commercial waterways. These were not small animals. Some individuals could reach weights of 0.5 kilogram or more, significantly larger than a healthy domestic cat, and in many cases larger than Simon himself. They were aggressive, territorial, and not at all inclined toward discretion. They had learned over generations of cohabitation with humans that humans presented little threat and significant opportunity. On a ship under siege with food stores dwindling and the careful hygiene protocols of normal naval life disrupted by the constant emergency, they were emboldened. Simon was not emboldened. Simon was simply better at this than they were. He had the patience of his species and the skill that came from years of practice in the particular geography of the ship's holds and corridors. He killed systematically and without ceremony, leaving the evidence of his work, dead rats at thresholds in passageways near the food stores, as a running commentary on his continuing effectiveness. The ship's medical officer noted a measurable decline in the contamination of food stores during the siege period compared to what would have been expected under normal conditions. In other words, Simon was keeping them healthier. The rats that Simon killed were rats that could not infect the water supply, could not contaminate the grain, could not spread leptospirosis through the tight spaces of a vessel where men were already weakened by stress and reduced rations. The difference between a crew that remained functional and a crew devastated by an epidemic in those conditions was not a metaphorical difference. It was the difference between escape and surrender. Let me tell you about the wounded men. In the makeshift ward below decks, where the most seriously injured sailors lay in the summer heat with wounds that were healing slowly because the ship's medical supplies were running low, Simon made his rounds with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to his hunting. He was not trained to do this. There is no cat training for this. He simply understood, in whatever way cats understand things, that the men in that room were not well, and that his presence was wanted. He would lie beside them in their bunks. He would sit on the edges of cots and watch the faces of sleeping men with the focused attention of a sentry. sailors who were too injured to sleep, who lay awake in the Yangtze night listening to the sounds of the river and the distant sounds of a revolution completing itself on the banks around them. These men found that a warm, purring cat against their leg was sufficient sometimes to allow the body to relax into the sleep it desperately needed. Sleep heals. Simon understood this without understanding it, and he administered it without measure and without agenda to anyone who seemed to need it. There was a boy, a very young rating, barely 18 years old, who had lost two close friends in the initial attack. He did not speak for 3 days after the engagement. He ate when ordered to eat, slept when ordered to sleep, performed his duties with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has removed himself from the process of living because living has become temporarily too expensive. Simon found him on the second night. He climbed into the boy's bunk and sat on his chest. He did not purr immediately. He simply sat there, heavy and warm and present, until the boy's breathing began to slow, until the locked muscles of his chest began to release, until finally his hands moved up and found the cat in the dark. He held Simon. He did not speak. He did not weep. He simply held a small, damaged, recovering cat in the dark on a damaged, recovering ship on a dark river. And whatever passed between them in that silence was sufficient, because in the morning he was present again, not healed, never fully healed, but present, back inside the life he had almost abandoned. If you're watching this and you've ever had a pet that seemed to understand you better than the humans around you, then you know what I'm talking about. And I want you to think about what it would mean to have that specific, wordless, judgment-free presence in the middle of the worst experience of your life. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been helped through a hard time by an animal? Because the crew of the HMS Amethyst had a specific answer to that question, and the answer was a 4-pound black and white cat named Simon. June became July. July became August. The food stores were critically low. Lieutenant Commander Cairns had been conducting careful, methodical negotiations with the PLA Shore Command, but both sides knew that no political resolution was forthcoming. The British government was not going to sign anything. The PLA was not going to let a Royal Navy frigate steam downriver to freedom as if the revolution hadn't happened. The situation had reached its equilibrium of impossibility, and in such situations, at some point, someone has to act. Cairns made his decision in the second week of July. He told no one outside the immediate command staff. He ordered the ship to make itself ready, quietly, without ceremony, without any of the preparations that an observing enemy would recognize as preparations for a departure. He waited for a moonless night. The date he chose was July 30th, 1949. The Amethyst had been trapped on the Yangtze for 101 days. In the time it takes to read that sentence, I want you to pause and let that number settle. 101 days. More than 3 months. 3 months of diminishing food, of rationed water, of medical supplies running out, of knowing that the men who died in the initial attack were buried on shore in foreign earth, of watching the summer heat build over the river and the mosquitoes come, and the sickness that the mosquitoes brought, of going to sleep every night not knowing if the PLA batteries would open fire again before morning. 101 days of Simon continuing his rounds, his hunts, his visits to the wounded. 101 days of the small, persistent, unbroken routine of a cat who had decided that this was his ship and these were his people, and nothing that was happening in the larger world was going to change that. At 2200 on July 30th, Cairns gave the order. The Amethyst's engines, carefully maintained through the siege, came to life. The ship slipped her anchor in the darkness, with no lights, no radio transmissions, moving as quietly as a 1,000-ton frigate can move on a wide river in the summer night. She began to run for the sea. The shore batteries noticed almost immediately. The fire started within minutes of the Amethyst's departure, and what followed was a 60-mile running battle down the Yangtze in the dark, with Cairns pushing his damaged engines to their limits and his crew at action stations, and the PLA artillery tracking them as best it could in the darkness, and the river, wide and ancient and indifferent, finally offering its current as at least a neutral ally, carrying them toward the sea at a pace that the shore-based guns could not quite match. The Amethyst took more hits during the escape. More men were wounded. One man was killed. The ship was struck repeatedly and yet did not stop, because Cairns had calculated that stopping was not an option, and he was right. And the engines that had been so carefully maintained through the siege held, and the darkness that had seemed like a threat revealed itself as a shield, and at 2300, racing through the last stretch of river before the open sea, the Amethyst sent a signal that would be printed on the front pages of newspapers across Britain the following morning. It said, "Have rejoined the fleet, no longer Yangtze." In its understatement, in its refusal to dramatize its naval English compression of 3 months of hell into a single quiet sentence, it is one of the great messages in the history of the Royal Navy. Somewhere on that ship, as it raced through the darkness toward freedom, a small black and white cat was doing his rounds. The welcome that HMS Amethyst received when she reached Hong Kong was the welcome of heroes, and it was deserved. Cairns was mentioned in dispatches, decorated, celebrated. The crew was treated as the remarkable body of men they were. The story of the Yangtze Incident became a touchstone of British naval pride, at a moment when British power in the world was contracting daily. A reminder that the qualities that had made the Royal Navy great, discipline, endurance, the refusal to be broken, were still present in the men who served it. The newspapers wanted photographs. The public wanted details. The newsreel cameras wanted footage. And they wanted Simon, the cat who had been there from the beginning, who had been wounded and had returned, who had hunted and healed and held the line in his own small, irreplaceable way. Simon was a story that the British public understood immediately and completely, because the British public has always understood the particular valor of the creature that simply keeps going, that asks for nothing and gives everything, that does not know the word surrender because the word was never relevant to anything it was doing. Simon was promoted, formally, officially, with paperwork, because the Royal Navy does not do things informally, even when it is doing things that are charming. He was promoted to the rank of Able Seaman, and this promotion was backdated to include the period of the siege, and he was mentioned in dispatches, and his record included the line that has become perhaps the most understated military citation in history. Served on HMS Amethyst during the Yangtze Incident, displaying daring and devotion to duty. He was also awarded the Dickin Medal. This requires explanation for those who are not familiar with it. The Dickin Medal is the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, the highest award for animal gallantry in the British honor system. It was created in 1943 by Maria Dickin, the founder of the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, to recognize animals that displayed conspicuous gallantry or devotion to duty in war. It had been awarded to carrier pigeons who had delivered messages under fire, to dogs who had located bomb victims in the rubble of the Blitz, to a horse who had continued carrying his rider after being wounded by shrapnel. It was now being awarded to a cat who had been smuggled aboard in a sailor's cap, who had been burned and blasted and had walked out of his recovery box after 5 days and gone back to work, who had hunted rats in the hold while PLA artillery tried to sink his home, who had sat with wounded men in the Yangtze night and given them something that medicine could not provide. The Dickin Medal was to be formally presented in Britain. Simon was prepared for the voyage home. He was cleaned and photographed, and, in accordance with British law, which required all animals entering the United Kingdom from abroad to undergo a period of quarantine, he was placed in the quarantine kennels at Hackbridge in Surrey upon the ship's arrival in Britain in November of 1949. He had survived artillery. He had survived burns and shrapnel. He had survived 101 days of siege and a running battle down a dark river. He had crossed the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. He was home. He died on November 28, 1949, in the Hackbridge quarantine kennels. He was approximately 2 years old. The cause was a viral infection, the kind of infection that a cat whose immune system had been through the particular punishment that Simon's had been through is simply not equipped to fight. He had come through everything the war could throw at him. And in the end, it was a quiet room in Surrey that killed him, not with fire or iron, but with the invisible weight of all the accumulated damage that his body had been carrying since that April morning on the Yangtze. The news was reported in the Times of London, not in a small notice on the back pages in the Times, the paper of record, the paper that covered the deaths of prime ministers and generals and kings. The letters came in from across the country. Sailors who had served on the Amethyst wrote. Sailors who had never been near the Amethyst wrote. Ordinary British citizens who had never served a day in any military capacity wrote, because the story of Simon was a story they recognized at a level deeper than reason, a story about loyalty and endurance and the particular kind of courage that asks nothing of itself because it has never considered any alternatives. He was buried with full naval honors at the PDSA Animal Cemetery in Ilford, in a small grave that bears a headstone that reads, "In memory of Simon, Able Seaman, served in HMS Amethyst, 1948 to 1949, awarded Dickin Medal, died 28th November 1949. Throughout the Yangtze Incident, his behavior was of the highest order. Of the highest order. The language of military citations applied to a black and white cat from a Hong Kong dockyard who was smuggled aboard a ship in a sailor's cap and who, when his ship was attacked and burning, walked out of his recovery box after 5 days and went back to work. Of the highest order. If that phrase has ever been earned, it was earned here. There is a question that sits at the heart of this story, and it is not a military question or a historical question or a question about the Yangtze Incident or the Chinese Civil War or British imperial decline. It is a simpler question, and in some ways a harder one. What do we owe to the creatures who choose us? I say choose because Simon chose. He chose George Hickenbottom on a dock in Hong Kong, and he chose the ship that Hickenbottom belonged to, and he chose, as definitively and as clearly as any being can choose anything, to remain in that choice, even when remaining meant pain and fire and danger. He did not need to be ordered to return to his duties after the attack. No order could have compelled him, and no order was ever given. He returned because the ship was his, and the men were his, and the work was his, and whatever else the world decided to do with itself, those things remained true. This is a thing that humans find difficult. We make our commitments contingent. We love conditionally. We serve our obligations until the cost of serving them exceeds some threshold that we set for ourselves, And then we revise our commitments or abandon them entirely, and we have entire philosophical and legal and cultural frameworks to justify doing so. Simon had no such frameworks. Simon had a ship and a crew and a job, and the fact that the ship was under fire did not change any of those three things. The commitment was prior to the circumstances. The loyalty was not a calculation, but a condition. The crew of the Amethyst, who were remarkable men in a remarkable situation, knew this. They knew it when they checked on his box during those 4 days when he lay still, and they were not sure he would return. They knew it when he walked out and made his rounds. They knew it when they watched him sit with the wounded men in the long nights of the siege, administering the wordless medicine of his presence to men who had no other way to receive it. They knew it when they carried him to the quarantine kennels in Britain and said goodbye, and they knew it when they heard he had died, and they gathered on their ship and on the docks of Portsmouth and in their homes across Britain, and they mourned him with a sincerity that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the recognition of something genuine when you have been in the presence of it. There is a school of thought that says animals are incapable of loyalty, that what we interpret as loyalty in animals is merely conditioning, habit, the programmed behavior of a brain that lacks the capacity for genuine commitment. I invite the proponents of this school of thought to explain Simon. I invite them to explain the 5 days in the box and the return to work. I invite them to explain the sick bay visits, the unordered patrols, the hunting that continued under artillery fire. I invite them to construct a theory of mere habit and conditioning that accounts for all of this, and I suspect they will find that the theory bends and breaks under the weight of the evidence, and that what they are left with, when they have removed every convenient abstraction, is the same thing the crew of the Amethyst was left with. A small black and white cat who decided that his people needed him and acted accordingly. The Dickin Medal that was awarded posthumously to Simon, the medal that he never lived to wear, is today on display at the Imperial War Museum in London. It is a small thing, a bronze medallion on a ribbon, and it sits in its case among the other accumulated evidence of human and animal courage in wartime, the photographs and the documents and the weapons and the uniforms. And it is, arguably, the most straightforwardly deserved item in the entire collection. Because Simon asked for nothing. He was given a cap to hide in on a Hong Kong dock, and he accepted the terms. And from that moment until the moment he died in a quarantine kennel in Surrey, he gave everything he had to the ship and the people who had become, without contract or ceremony, his responsibility. If this story has moved you, if the image of a burned and bandaged cat walking out of a recovery box and going back to his rounds has struck you somewhere deeper than you expected, then I want you to think about why. I want you to sit with that feeling for a moment. Because what Simon teaches us is not really about animals, and it is not really about war, and it is not really about the Yangtze Incident, or the end of British imperial power in Asia, or the particular naval bureaucracy of the 1940s. What Simon teaches us is about the nature of presence, about what it means to show up, not because the conditions are right, not because you have weighed the risks and found them acceptable, not because showing up benefits you in some way you can calculate and justify, but simply because this is where you belong and these are your people, and there is work to be done. There are humans who manage this. They are the people we remember. They are the people who, when we look back on the hardest periods of our lives, we find standing there, quiet and steady, having asked for nothing. They are the ones who showed up when it would have been entirely understandable for them to stay away. They did not make a speech about it. They did not require recognition. They brought what they had, warmth, presence, a willingness to share the weight, and they gave it freely, and the giving was so complete and so unconditional that we didn't even have the words for it at the time. We just knew it felt like Simon. We just knew it felt like a warm weight in the dark on a ship that had been burning, and like something in us exhaling, slowly, back toward the possibility of tomorrow. The HMS Amethyst was decommissioned in 1957. She was broken up for scrap. The river she had fought on still flows through the heart of a China transformed beyond recognition from the country it was in 1949. The men who served on her have grown old and died, one by one, until the last of them is gone. But the grave in Ilford remains, and the medal in the Imperial War Museum remains, and the story remains. Told and retold across the decades, because some stories refuse to stay in the past, because they contain something that every generation recognizes as necessary, as true, as belonging to the permanent vocabulary of human experience. The cat who held the line, the ship that would not surrender, the crew that refused to break, and a small grave with a headstone that says, in the unadorned language of the Royal Navy, that throughout the Yangtze Incident, his behavior was of the highest order. It was the highest order of all, because Simon did not know there was any other order. He knew only the ship and the crew and the rats and the wounded men who needed company in the dark. He knew only what needed doing, and he did it. If this story has made you feel something tonight, if you thought of someone who showed up for you when they didn't have to, a person or an animal who held the line when everything else was falling apart, leave their name in the comments. Tell us about them. Because the world should know about the people who behave in their own small and irreplaceable ways of the highest order. And if you've never heard this story before, and you want to hear more stories like it, stories about the animals who went to war and what they taught us about ourselves, then make sure you're subscribed. Because this is what we do here, and we are just getting started. Simon would have approved. I'm sure of it.